So, in the continuation of our story of what's happening in the United States prior to the Civil War, one of the things that's happening is the elements, the things that are actually made in the economy are changing. And what we're seeing is not necessarily rapid, but we do see a greater industrialization within the economy. And given what we've talked about in the previous chapters, we also just see an expansion of the market, both because of the westward movement, but also an expansion as we build up more export markets. And that's sort of our focus here in chapter 10. So what we see is that between the Constitution being passed in 1783 and the Civil War starting in 1860, is that between those 2 points in time, that essentially all of the elements by 1860 were in place for a much more rapid industrialization after the Civil War, and that this started largely in the northern states, which obviously helped them win the Civil War, but then also would be kind of the new economic center for the United States, replacing the southern colonies back from previous to 1783. Um, by 1860, the manufacturing sector in the United States was almost as large, not as large, but almost as large as Great Britain, which was the largest in the world. And even though this was still a relatively small scale compared to what it would be by the late 19th century, it was still pretty big. And this was, again, a big change because this is only what the United States at this point is only about 80 years old. And so in 80 years, it's transforming from a largely agricultural to an increasingly um, industrial economy. And as we talked about in the previous chapters, it required greater transportation system and infrastructure, and it also relied on the plentiful land that existed. As the country becomes has greater industrialization, it also requires that we have more rules and regulations regarding businesses. When we think about what an agricultural economy needs, or what it needed basically at the turn of the 19th century, um, you know, as the textbook points out, most of the clothing was homemade, most of the food was made at home, grown at home. Um, you, if you had to buy anything, you were buying it locally, and by 1830, so kind of our halfway point here, by 1830 in this era, what we see is that starting in the eastern colonies, that households are starting to manufacture less stuff for that within their household. So, right, they're using obviously the greater transportation of things. Um, this transportation just meant that you didn't have to produce as much at home, that you had greater markets where you could find things basically. And what you also see is that you start to see this emergence of corporations. Corporations start to emerge, and as well, what we're seeing is that we're getting more mills, sawmills, flour mills, and what this is allowing for is larger scale processing of agricultural goods and larger scale processing of wood, that commodity that was just so plentiful in the United States. These factories, let's see here, these factories that are emerging, what's good about them, and they start largely in the cotton industry, is that the nice thing um, about factories is that you obviously get a substantial output of a product that's going to be pretty consistent. And what you're also going to see is workers who start to become accustomed to how factory life is, and you get greater productivity along with it. And so these cotton mills, cotton textile mills that start in the South slowly are drawn north, such that you get to a point where, again, by like 1815, 1820, you almost have more cotton mills in New England than you do in the South, where the cotton was actually being grown. And so we kind of have this just general description here. Um, the specialization of workers, again, that's really only possible as you get these factories emerging. You also see, especially on the East Coast, and we saw this in the previous chapters when we were talking about the colonial economic structure, that we had a great deal of iron that was being produced in the United States. Well, that's going to be a perfect placement of um, that's going to be a perfect placement for iron would be the factories system, because you want to get those lower costs. But you also see, though, and what becomes a bit required is that we have um, even just the legal concept of what a business is, of what a corporation is, has to start to emerge. The earliest corporations become the banks, the insurance companies, right? These kind of very large, money intensive businesses that rely on a great deal of capital. And then what you also see is that it quickly turns to the canals and the railroads, the things that also require a great deal of capital and organizational skill beyond what a single family, um, could provide if it was like a sort of home business. And so you need corporations for the building of the economic infrastructure that we'll look at here in the next chapter, chapter 12, but also the transportation infrastructure that we looked at in chapter 9. Um, the corporation that existed back then didn't look the same. It didn't look the same today as it was back then. In the early days, these corporations were established by the states. They were established by charters. And it wasn't entirely clear what the shareholders, what they would be liable for. Today, you can establish a corporation, and you can kind of pick the state where you want to become incorporated. And the advantage to doing that is that don't have you don't have personal liability anymore. You have limited liability to the extent that the corporation has assets that can be drawn upon, but they would never accrue to you personally. And that basically encourages people to take on risks because they know that they won't, personally be responsible for any of the losses taken on. Um, so that limited liability became pretty important. And then what we also see is that by no longer requiring that a corporation only be established by a special charter, what that does is it makes it so that corporations aren't a special favor anymore. You don't need a ton of political connections. You don't need to know important people. Anyone can establish a corporation. And this more modern form of the corporation starts to emerge in the late 1830s. And it quickly spreads across to the other states. When we look at what let's see here if the notes has it here. It doesn't really. Let me go back here. Let's see. So from the textbook, what we can see here is that by 1860, the leading industries, manufacturing industries, again, cotton would be top, and that was just ideal for the factory system. Following that, boots and shoes, and then following that, men's clothing. Again, iron, pretty important as well, and then lumber, pretty important as well. Flour and meal, that would have also been done with the mill system. But what you can see here is that, the scale of the value being produced and whatnot, the top, 5 or 6 items being produced are being produced by large scale factory settings. That's pretty significant. Then what you see as well in this kind of description of things is that you have the emergence in this time period of the putting out system. And what the putting out system does for us is it becomes this transitional moment between the early part of this era at the turn of the 19th century when things are being produced at home, and the end of this era, 1860, when you see this factory production occurring. Okay, let me pause here for a moment. So in this putting out system, the merchants are basically taking these raw materials that the rural households are providing. And the rural households, what they're doing is they're processing these into finished goods. Then the merchant turns around, collects the finished goods, and then sells them in the wider market. So the merchant, in some sense, is the middleman. You have basically household production of the good itself, the finished good itself, and then it's up to the merchant to find the market for their distribution. What it means is that that in this putting out system, you get a bit more production because you can have some degree of greater specialization, right? Where a household will focus on the production of just one kind of good. Now, it's a bit inefficient, right? It's decentralized. Merchants have to go around household to household to both distribute the natural resources, the raw materials, and then also pick up the finished goods that are all being produced within the household. Also, the merchant isn't micromanaging that production process, so it's up to the household how they're going to engage in quality control and even just the general pace of the products that are being produced. You can't really control the inventory very well, or even just, again, the general quality of the production of the process. So the putting out system is truly transitional here. So again, you got our greater production. Rural families like this though because they are going to get a source of hard income, of outside money that's outside of barter. And it starts to get households and just markets in general used to this idea that they don't have to produce everything themselves, that things can be purchased. And additionally, with that putting out system, they now have some of the money to spend. But as I said, got high transportation costs, especially with the transportation infrastructure that's still in the developmental phase and not entirely reliable. We've got the quality control issues, which are quite notable. And again, it's just an inefficient system in general. A lot of just removing around of the same inventory from place to place with no real ability to plan reliably on what that flow of production is going to look like. And so because of these disadvantages, most notably with the putting out system, the factory emerges. Centralize it, right? Get the workers to all come to a common place, provide them a common set of training, and then supervise them to make sure that they're adhering to what they said they would, right? That's actually kind of defines largely the kind of structure that we see around us today, right? That workers are supervised, they're told what they need to deliver, what kind of product, what kind of output they need to deliver, and then we ensure that they do deliver that kind of output. And so this transition to the factory production gets us the emergence now of a developed economy that's going to rely on the transportation infrastructure that's being built to kind of encapsulate these productivity gains to get these big advantages. What it also means is that you're going to have greater need for centralized power sources, and you're going to need that because it's also going to come with the idea of having big, expensive machinery that you can rely on. And on top of all that, what it means is that you start to build up workers that work for a wage, right? And you get the emergence now of not working for family, but rather working for an employer. And that's, again, you need that kind of formalism in the establishment of a modern, developed economy. And that's what we start to see here, right? We start to see this idea that that if you're centralizing the machinery and if you're centralizing even the power sources, you're going to get the power loom, which you're going to use in the textile industry, and even just use the cotton gin, which you would use for turning the raw material, the raw cotton material, into cotton that can be woven into textiles that can be purchased. And Eli Whitney, who invents this cotton gin, the reason why it becomes so popular is that the standardized machines could be repaired more simply because the parts were interchangeable and were standardized, right? So that would mean that you could go to a factory in the Northeast, and as long as it was using the same machinery, it would be operated similarly as one that you would find in the South. Interestingly enough, that had never been done before. For in the United States, we'd not had those interchangeable parts. Geez, AI. Here, the interchangeable part looks to be a gun of some kind. AI. Yeah, what do interchangeable parts give for us? Again, simplified repairs, but that it would also mean that workers can pretty easily move from factory to factory, and that workers aren't going to need as much retraining as these machines get continually updated and whatnot. Now, when we look at this, let's go back to the chapter. What you see here as well then is that if we look at all the regions of the United States, that by 1860, we largely see that especially in the middle Atlantic, you have a large number of firms with a huge amount of capital. Look at that, $435 million, with nearly 500,000 workers who are male, another 100,000 female, for a production value of the products being $802 million. That's huge. And that's all just occurring in the middle Atlantic. Well, look at that. Compare that to the South, which only 60 years earlier had been the economic center for the newly established country. The companies are not here, right? That in the South, you don't have that many firms, far less capital invested, and whatnot. We shouldn't be then that surprised that the Civil War ended the way that it did, because it's just underdeveloped. I mean, quite frankly, the Midwest is larger than the South, and the Midwest has only been only established 30 years earlier. 1830s is when you largely get the Midwest developing. Again, cities like Chicago, Milwaukee, even St. Louis, are becoming much bigger than the firms that we would have had in the South. And as the book points out here, that in that 50-year time period between 1810 and 1860, the value of the goods that are being manufactured increases nearly tenfold, from 200 million to nearly $2 billion, $1.89 billion. It's quite a bit. Okay, pause here for a second. And so this emergence of the factory system and these large factories, this move from the putting out system, while it's initially used for cotton, it quickly spreads to the other more established industries that we already had, which would be things like the iron production, the shipbuilding, things that were done a bit more small scale before would now have a factory where the workers would come to this common corporation, and things would be produced. And what that means as well is that you get a greater prevalence of cities, right? Because the factory and the urban environment go hand in hand with each other, right? Where you need a lot of people, and as well, that's in this kind of structure where you would have to have a system of power as well. Now, where we start to see this, at least in the textile industry, is with the Lowell system. So in the Lowell system, what you're doing is you're bringing young women from the rural areas to the city, right? And you kind of provide for all their needs, but basically they're there just to keep working. So the employers, as we have here in element number 2, the employers are going to provide in the beginning under the Lowell system, provide the housing, the cultural activities, and supervise the workers so that the parents would be willing to let their daughters, go to work in the factory. And what that means is that the employers, investing a bit more in kind of controlling every aspect of their lives, but then they get the benefit of controlling every aspect of their life, which would mean pushing them to work even harder than they otherwise would. And that's what we see here, both long hours, and you can pay them less because you could say, I'm providing all these other things that you need. And for the struggling family that's out on the frontier, they're going to be more likely than not be willing to send children, and they're going to be more likely to be willing to send workers to a factory setting that they might think is even dangerous because they really need that income coming in. This part right here, not really true. you're not going to start to see unions in any meaningful way uh, in the 1800s. Um, it does not, that's, AI is just wrong here. And so this comes here as well. Now, in the one chapter that I skipped, chapter 17, um, you will see a greater discussion of this, but this is largely untrue. You really don't see in any meaningful way any great emergence of unions, at least in the 19th century, that's notable to mention. So I would disagree with the elements of slide 17. Instead, right, um, you get the courts and even the state politicians more in support of the interests of businesses rather than of workers. And you don't, and so here's the thing, right? Especially with the second thing, the second comment that's made here is that, worker or employers were given freedom of contract. So they didn't have to just employ union workers if a union was present at the firm. Unlike today, right, where you have to be a part of the union or the employer can only hire workers represented by that union once the union exists. That wasn't the case um, in the 19th century. And yeah, I don't even think I don't think this is true either. So again, this would be AI getting it wrong. In this case, um, no, you're just not going to see the legal environment. Well, at least you're not going to see the legal environment being shaped to encourage businesses to establish friendlier relationships with employees. That just doesn't happen. And so I'm not sure why AI is thinking that the unions are strongly emerging here in the 19th century, because it's not. Okay, we already kind of talked about this. Okay, let me pause here for a moment. Sorry, I wanted to take a small break there because I just wanted to make sure I wasn't being inaccurate here. But no, AI is wrong on this, as I suspected. You're not going to get any meaningful unions being formed here until after the Civil War. And I'm not sure why AI is thinking otherwise. Um, it's not coming from the book, and it's not factual. You're not really seeing any of the first meaningful national unions until the late 1860s, early 1970s, as the pace of industrialization rapidly increases. You're certainly not going to see that in the first half of the 19th century, which is our focus here. So I stand by what I said. Um, but what comes about again through this greater transportation infrastructure that we have, this greater um, just industrialization in general, is that again, you're just going to have an enhancement of specialization by region, where in the Northeast, you've got increased manufacturing, where in the South, you've got increased production of cotton, and on the frontier, you've got greater production of corn, wheat, and livestock, cattle, and whatnot, and hogs to some extent. Um, all of these linked by a transportation infrastructure, and that you get the greater magnitude of the production within each of these regions by employing a bit more of a factory system. And that's what we see right here, right? Is that the markets are expanding, they're fueled by the transportation system that exists. and they're fueled by just the greater scale of production that can occur with factories. And you get the emergence of assembly lines, certainly within the mills, but also in the factories. As the cities are emerging, again, you get a pretty good set of workers, but you then also have a place where where you would place these factories, where then you get a consumer for the power, and the power. We don't want to say electricity yet because it's not going to be electricity, but it's going to be what we'd call motive power, just movement. And you would see this with water. The book actually has a really good description, among the best I've seen. Let's see here, page 175. Where you see this here, right? And this would be kind of your classic image. I think there's a picture right here with your kind of like water mill kind of thing, water wheel, where the water is moving the wheel, it's turning an axle, which is like turning the grain, right? Or turning something inside, right? And you're seeing that thing turning here, right? Of the different ways that we could design the water wheel system. But again, you would see that in a factory setting. What you also see as a consequence of this, of just the factory system and even of the cities, is that you are going to see reduced living conditions for workers, just because you don't have a union, which again, I don't know why the slides thought we did, but you're just going to have greater poverty, longer working hours, just more dangerous working conditions. And then you're also going to have greater disparity in the accumulation of wealth and just the general economic prosperity between workers and employers. And so you see this just general rise of the business class or the moneyed in the United States in the early 19th century. So you've got these wealthy industrialists that are emerging, that are building strong relationships with the government, and then pushing the government to pass policies that encourage even the greater development of business and the capitalist system in general. And what you see as well, and the book doesn't talk about it as much, but the slides do, and I actually think this would be something that the book should have mentioned more, but didn't. It would be that, so I think it was 1818. You weren't bringing in any new slaves into the United States, so that by 1818 you were kind of stuck with who you had. Um, but slavery, and the idea or the thought, at least at the time, was that slavery would just kind of die away as the people died away. But they didn't. In this case, the slaves kept replicating, right? Having children, and those children would grow up in slavery as well. And so slavery became strong. It was enhanced by the fact that you were still growing all of this cotton, and that was a pretty valuable export still, even in the lead up to the Civil War. And it made slavery something that the South wasn't going to willingly then give up, because it was central to their economic prosperity, whatever prosperity they had compared to the North. So removing slavery did truly require the Civil War. There's no way that the South is going to give it up otherwise. And yes, then you do require some sense of people with conviction that are willing to say that we need to be a country that is without slavery, as most other countries were um, by the mid 19th century. The United States was in some sense unique. The one thing that the slides do not talk about is that in the 19th century, though, you also have the emergence of tariffs that are pretty strong. So tariffs would be the taxes that we impose on imported goods. And as you can see, so these tariffs are important because they're actually providing the bulk of revenue for the central government, because at the time we're not taxing income. But as you can see here, at least in the early 1800s out to 1860, you have some pretty high tariffs that are designed again to protect American manufacturing. And the only thing you can then really do is if you get rid of the tariffs, then the other country would be likely to give up tariffs as well. But you can see that these tariffs are just moving around all the time. And again, they hit their peak, as we'll see in chapter 23, towards the end of this course, that they reach their peak with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that in some sense extend or make more severe the Great Depression that had started. What else do I want to say that the slides didn't have here? I've largely said that, and I've largely said that. Okay, again, this is another rather short chapter, but again, I felt it was necessary, if only to kind of better describe the kind of economy that's going to be going to war in the Civil War, and why the Civil War basically got decided the way that it did, where the North did win, and that it wasn't that surprising that the North won. Okay.